The cows refused to enter the south pasture for the third straight day. Not one of them. 47 head of Angus cattle stood shoulder to shoulder against a fence in Jackson County, Iowa, in June of 1986, staring at the same patch of ground as if something was waiting there. 80-year-old Walter Hensley noticed it immediately. Everyone else laughed. Walter had been raising cattle on the same 320 acres outside Maquoketa since 1941. His hands looked like they had been carved from walnut wood. His boots carried the dust of 4 decades of corn harvests. He was not a man who rushed conclusions, and he was not a man who frightened easily. But when he saw those cattle refusing to cross into the south pasture, he stopped walking. He stood quietly beside the fence and watched. The pasture itself looked perfectly normal. The grass was thick. The water trough was full. The fencing had been repaired only 2 months earlier. Nothing seemed wrong. Yet 47 animals refused to step forward. Not one. That afternoon, Walter's daughter, Susan, drove over from nearby Dubuque County to help with vaccinations. She noticed it too. "Dad, what's got into them?" Walter never took his eyes off the herd. "I don't know yet." That answer surprised her. Walter usually knew. He knew when rain was coming before weather reports mentioned it. He knew when corn roots were struggling long before leaves changed color. And he knew cattle, especially cattle. If he said he didn't know, it meant something genuinely unusual was happening. The next morning, the herd behaved exactly the same way. They walked toward the pasture gate, stopped, stared, and backed away. A few younger animals let out nervous calls. Several older cows paced along the fence. One bull lowered his head and snorted repeatedly at the same stretch of ground. Walter watched all of it. Then he drove back toward the equipment shed. Inside sat the machine he trusted almost as much as his own instincts. A 1952 Farmer Lamb. Bright red once. Faded crimson now. The tractor had been purchased new by Walter's father in September 1952 from a dealer in Cedar Rapids for $2,420. 40 horsepower, over 5,000 pounds. Simple enough to repair with basic tools. Strong enough to pull through Iowa clay for decades. The farmer had planted corn, pulled wagons, mowed hay, and cleared snow through 3 generations of Hensleys. Walter still changed the oil every spring. Still kept records in a notebook, still stored indoors every winter. To most people, it was old machinery. To Walter, it was family history made of steel. Let me tell you about that tractor. Walter's father bought it during one of the strongest farming years the family had ever experienced. The old horse teams were becoming too expensive to maintain. Labor was harder to find. Mechanization was changing everything. Neighbors thought the purchase was reckless. $2,400 was serious money in 1952, but the farm paid for itself faster than anyone expected. It worked through drought years, wet years, good harvests, bad harvests. When Walter buried his father in 1968, the tractor led the procession back to the farm. He never forgot that. Machines can become memories if they stay long enough. That afternoon, Walter used a farmer to inspect every foot of the south pasture. Nothing. No broken pipe. No sinkhole. No predator tracks. No poisonous weeds. Everything appeared normal, which somehow worried him more. By the end of the week, word had spread. Small towns run on conversation. Soon everybody seemed to know about Walter's stubborn cattle. One of those people was Kevin Mercer, 34 years old, vice president of a regional agricultural lending office, college-educated, sharp-dresser, successful, confident. Kevin represented a new generation of agriculture, computers, efficiency reports, expansion plans, profit projections. He respected numbers. He trusted data. And he didn't think much of old farmers who relied on instinct. When he heard about Walter's cattle, he decided to visit, mostly out of curiosity, partly for amusement. The following Tuesday, Kevin parked his new pickup beside Walter's barn. Several neighboring farmers happened to be there discussing hay prices. Walter stood quietly near the fence, watching the herd. Kevin looked toward the cattle, then toward the pasture, then back at Walter. "You're telling me they won't go in there?" Walter nodded. That's right. Kevin chuckled. They're cows. Nobody answered. Kevin laughed harder. The kind of laugh that grows louder because other people aren't joining in. You got thousands of dollars worth of cattle standing around because they don't like a field? A few men shifted uncomfortably. Walter remained calm, completely calm. I didn't say they don't like it. Kevin folded his arms. Then what's the problem? Walter looked across the pasture. They know something. That earned another laugh. A bigger one. Several people looked away. Kevin shook his head. With respect, Walter, cattle don't know things people don't. Walter nodded slowly. Maybe. Nothing more. No argument. No anger. No raised voice. Just one word. Maybe. For some reason. That bothered Kevin more than if Walter had shouted. Later that evening, Kevin drove away still smiling. The old man was imagining problems. The animals were acting strange. That was all. At least that's what he thought. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The horses had stopped using the southern edge of their paddock. The barn cats no longer crossed behind the grain bins. Even Walter's aging border collie, Duke, refused to walk near the fence bordering the pasture. 3 different species. The same reaction. Walter noticed. Nobody else did. 2 mornings later, he woke before sunrise and stepped onto the porch. The farm felt wrong. Not dangerous. Wrong. Silent. The usual dawn sound seemed muted. No birds in the cottonwoods. No movement in the grass. No distant calls. Just silence. Then he noticed Duke. The dog stood perfectly still, facing south, growling. Walter followed his gaze toward the pasture, and for the first time in 60 years on that farm, he saw something that made his stomach tighten, because in the exact spot the animals had been watching all week, the ground had started to move. Walter stood motionless on the porch. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The sun had not fully risen yet. Long shadows stretched across the pasture. Morning fog hung low over the grass. But the movement was real. The ground shifted again. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. A patch of earth perhaps 20 feet across seemed to settle downward before slowly rising back into place. Walter grabbed his binoculars from the kitchen table. He stepped outside. The old boards on the porch creaked beneath his boots. Through the lenses, he watched carefully. Nothing. Then another movement. Small, subtle, but unmistakable. The earth was moving. By 8 o'clock, he had called the Jackson County Soil Conservation Office. The receptionist promised to send someone when available. Unfortunately, available turned out to mean next week. Budget cuts. Staff shortages. Too many calls. Not enough inspectors. Walter thanked her anyway. Then he hung up. He had lived long enough to know that waiting was sometimes necessary, but not always wise. The cattle still refused to enter the pasture. The horses remained nervous. Even Duke stayed close to the house. That afternoon, Walter climbed onto the Farmel M. The old engine started after only 2 turns. Its familiar rumble echoed across the yard. The sound comforted him. It always had. He drove slowly toward the fence line, not into the pasture, just close enough to observe. The tractor idled while Walter studied the area through binoculars. Again, the earth shifted. This time the movement lasted longer. A slow sinking, a slow rise, almost like breathing. Walter shut off the engine. The silence returned. And beneath that silence, he heard something unexpected. Water, far below, moving. He couldn't see it, but he could hear it. A faint rushing sound beneath the soil. That evening, Susan arrived again. Walter explained everything. She listened carefully. Unlike Kevin Mercer, she never laughed at her father. She had learned long ago that Walter noticed things others missed. You think it's underground water? She asked. Maybe. You sound unsure. I am. Walter stared toward the pasture. Something's changing under there. The next day brought visitors. Not experts. Neighbors. Curiosity travels fast in farming communities. Soon 6 pickup trucks lined the gravel road. Farmers gathered near the fence. Everyone wanted to look. Everyone had a theory. Sinkhole. Broken tile drainage. underground spring, buried septic system, old mine shaft. Nobody agreed. Around noon, Kevin Mercer appeared again. This time he arrived wearing sunglasses and carrying the confidence of a man who expected to be proven right. The gathering amused him. "What are we investigating today?" he asked. Nobody answered. Walter remained focused on the pasture. Kevin smirked. "You still think the animals know some secret?" Walter looked at him. "I think they're trying to tell us something." Kevin laughed again. Several others joined him this time, not because they agreed, because laughing is easier than admitting uncertainty. Kevin pointed toward the pasture. "Let's settle this." Before anyone could stop him, he climbed through the fence. Then he began walking directly toward the area the animals had avoided. Walter's eyes narrowed. "Kevin!" The younger man waved dismissively. "I'm fine." "Kevin!" The warning sounded stronger this time. Kevin ignored it. The crowd watched. Step after step. Nothing happened. 20 yards. 30. 40. He turned back toward the fence, spread his arms, and smiled. "There." A few people chuckled. Kevin pointed toward Walter. "Looks perfectly normal to me." Then the ground beneath his right boot sank 6 inches. The smile vanished. The crowd went silent. Kevin stumbled backward. The soil shifted again. A circular crack appeared in the grass. Not large, not dramatic, but very real. Kevin froze. Nobody moved. For several seconds, the entire pasture seemed to hold its breath. Then the crack widened. Another inch. Then 2. Kevin quickly retreated. The moment he reached solid ground near the fence, everyone started talking at once. No longer laughing. Now concerned. Kevin's face had changed completely. For the first time, uncertainty replaced confidence. Walter climbed through the fence. Not toward the crack. Just close enough to study it. The opening measured nearly 12 feet across. Fresh soil lined the edges. Something beneath the pasture was collapsing. The question was what? Let me tell you about eastern Iowa geology. Most people think of farmland as simple ground, dirt, grass, crops. But beneath many parts of Iowa lies limestone bedrock, shaped by water over thousands of years. Rainwater slowly dissolves limestone. Tiny cracks become tunnels. Tunnels become caverns. And sometimes the earth above those spaces gives way without warning. What appears solid can actually be a thin roof over empty space. That matters because livestock often detect subtle changes long before humans notice them. Vibrations, sounds, shifts in pressure, things we rarely sense, things animals encounter every day. By sunset, county officials finally returned Walter's call. An inspection team promised to arrive the following morning. News spread even faster now. By evening, nearly everyone in the area knew something unusual was happening on the Hensley farm. Walter slept poorly, not because he was afraid, because he was thinking. The cattle, the horses, the cats, the dog. Every animal had reacted before any human being noticed the problem. That fact stayed with him. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Have you ever trusted your instincts even when the evidence wasn't fully visible yet? That's a lonely place to stand. Walter knew the feeling well. The next morning, 3 county vehicles rolled into the farmyard. Inspectors unloaded equipment, surveying tools, ground-penetrating instruments, maps, clipboards. For hours they worked. Walter watched quietly. Kevin returned too, this time without jokes, without laughter, without confidence. By late afternoon, the lead inspector approached the group. His expression was serious, very serious. He unfolded a map, then pointed directly beneath the south pasture. There appears to be a large underground void. Nobody spoke. The inspector continued. Much larger than we expected. How large? Susan asked. The man hesitated, then answered. Possibly larger than the entire pasture itself. Silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. Kevin stared at the map. Walter stared at the inspector. And then the inspector said something that nobody on that farm would ever forget. If our readings are correct, the collapse has already begun. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air above the pasture. The collapse has already begun. The lead inspector adjusted his glasses and looked back at the survey readings. I want to be very clear, he said. We're not talking about a small sinkhole. We're talking about a large underground cavity that appears to be expanding. Susan crossed her arms. How dangerous is it? The inspector exhaled slowly. We don't know yet. That answer worried Walter more than anything else. Experienced people usually knew what they were dealing with. When experts admitted uncertainty, it meant the situation was serious. By evening, yellow warning stakes surrounded nearly 30 acres of pasture. County officials recommended keeping all livestock away from the area. That wasn't difficult. The animals had already made that decision themselves. Walter stood beside the fence while the sun disappeared behind the hills. The cattle grazed peacefully on the north side of the farm, far from danger, far from the shifting earth. He watched them for a long time. Then he nodded quietly. They knew. Nobody argued. Not anymore. The following morning brought more specialists. This time they came from the University of Iowa. Geologists, hydrologists, engineers, people whose careers revolved around understanding what existed beneath the ground. Truck after truck arrived. Equipment covered the farmyard. The Hensley farm suddenly looked more like a research site than a cattle operation. Kevin Mercer showed up again, but this visit felt different. Gone was the easy confidence. Gone was the laughter. He spent most of the morning helping unload equipment. Nobody asked him to. He simply did it. Around noon, one of the geologists approached Walter. We found something interesting. Walter followed him toward a series of maps spread across a folding table. The scientist pointed toward a set of historical records. Your property sits above an abandoned underground water channel. Walter leaned closer. The maps dated back decades. Some were nearly a century old. The geologist continued. Most of these channels remain stable, but occasionally erosion accelerates. Why now? Susan asked. The scientist tapped another report. 3 unusually wet years. Record rainfall across portions of eastern Iowa. Millions of gallons of water had slowly altered the limestone beneath the farm. Nobody noticed. At least nobody human. Let me tell you about water. People often think powerful destruction arrives suddenly. A tornado, a flood, a fire. But water usually works differently. It is patient. It removes a grain of stone today, another tomorrow, 1,000 more next year. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't stop. And eventually it changes landscapes that appear permanent. That is exactly what had happened beneath Walter's pasture. The process had likely been occurring for years. The danger had been building silently. Then something unexpected happened. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, a technician running ground sensors called everyone over. The readings had changed dramatically. The underground cavity was growing faster than predicted. Much faster. The lead engineer reviewed the data twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked up. We need to evacuate this area immediately. The urgency in his voice erased any doubt. Equipment was packed up. Vehicles moved. People retreated beyond the marked boundaries. Walter climbed onto the farm LM, not because anyone asked him to, because there was still one piece of equipment inside the restricted zone, an old hay wagon. Nothing particularly valuable, but it belonged to his father. The wagon had been purchased in 1947. Walter wasn't about to leave it behind if he could help it. Kevin saw what he was doing. Walter, the old farmer, looked over. You shouldn't go in there. Walter nodded. Probably not. Then don't. Walter smiled faintly. The same calm smile he always wore. I'm just getting the wagon. Before Kevin could respond, the farm LM rumbled to life. The familiar engine echoed across the field. Walter drove slowly toward the wagon. Every person present watched. The tractor reached the wagon. Walter connected the hitch. Then he started back. Halfway to safety, the ground behind him collapsed. A deep cracking sound rolled across the pasture. Everyone turned. A massive section of earth dropped several feet. Grass, soil, fence posts, all disappearing into a newly formed depression. People gasped. Several stepped backward instinctively. Walter never accelerated, never panicked. The farmel continued forward at its steady pace, 5 miles per hour, exactly as it had for decades. The wagon followed behind. Safe, secure. The collapse stopped less than 50 yards from where he had been moments earlier. When Walter finally crossed the boundary markers, nobody said a word. The silence carried more respect than applause ever could. Kevin walked over slowly. His face looked pale. You could have been killed. Walter shut off the tractor. Could have. You knew the risk. Walter nodded. So, did the tractor? For the first time, Kevin laughed. Not mockingly, not arrogantly, just honestly. Then he shook his head. I owe you an apology. Walter looked at him. For what? For laughing. The old farmer studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Everybody's wrong sometimes. Kevin stared at the ground. Not like I was. Walter placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. Learning matters more. Those 4 words stayed with Kevin for years. Over the next week, engineers completed their investigation. The final results shocked everyone. The underground cavity stretched nearly 600 feet. In places, it measured over 60 feet deep. Entire sections of pasture had been sitting above empty space. The collapse could have happened months earlier, or years later. Nobody knew. What everyone did know was this. If the cattle had entered that pasture in large numbers, disaster was possible. If heavy machinery had crossed the wrong section of ground, lives could have been lost. If Walter had ignored the animals, the warning might never have been noticed until it was too late. Have you ever looked back on a moment and realized how close you came to a completely different future? A single decision, a single observation, a single warning. Sometimes the difference between catastrophe and survival is smaller than we imagine. The county eventually closed the entire southern pasture. Engineers developed stabilization plans. Researchers documented the site. Newspaper reporters arrived. Agricultural magazines published articles. People from neighboring counties came to see the famous pasture, where animals noticed danger before humans did. But among all the attention, one detail fascinated visitors most. Not the sinkhole, not the geology, not the engineering. The animals. Every expert agreed on one thing. The cattle had reacted days before measurable surface changes appeared. The horses had moved. The cats had avoided the area. The dog had refused to approach the fence. Something beneath the earth had spoken, and somehow the animals had listened. Yet the most surprising moment was still ahead, because during a county meeting 2 months later, Kevin Mercer stood up in front of a crowded room and made a statement nobody expected, especially Walter. The county meeting room in Maquoketa, Iowa, was never meant to hold a crowd like this. But on a humid morning in August 1986, people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, filling every wooden chair, even spilling into the hallway. Farmers, engineers, reporters, and at the center of it all, Walter Hensley sat quietly in the second row, hands folded, hat resting on his knee. He wasn't here to speak. He rarely was. At the front of the room, Kevin Mercer adjusted the microphone. He looked different now. No polished confidence. No easy smile. Just a man carrying something heavier than numbers. The meeting began with official updates, soil stabilization plans, insurance assessments, federal agricultural notes, but nobody was really listening. Everyone was waiting for Kevin. Finally, the chairman nodded toward him. Kevin stood. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he looked straight at Walter, and something shifted in the room. I came here thinking I understood farming, Kevin said. A pause. I thought it was numbers, yield reports, risk models, efficiency curves. He swallowed. I was wrong. The room stayed silent. Kevin continued. I laughed at a man who trusted his land more than he trusted me. I laughed at something I didn't understand. He exhaled slowly. That won't happen again. Walter didn't react outwardly, but something in his gaze softened just slightly, because that wasn't just an apology. That was change. After the meeting, Kevin walked outside alone. Walter followed him a few minutes later. They stood near the parking lot, where dust hung in the warm air. Kevin didn't turn at first. I almost got someone killed, he said quietly. Walter shook his head. You didn't know. That's not an excuse. Walter considered that. Then he replied, "No, but it's a starting point." Silence settled between them. Then Kevin finally asked a question that had been building inside him for weeks. How did they know? Walter looked toward the distant line of farmland, the same land that had held steady for generations, and then betrayed its own appearance. "I don't think they knew," Walter said. "They felt." Kevin frowned. "What's the difference?" Walter picked up a small stone from the gravel road, held it between his fingers. "When you work land long enough," he said, "you stop seeing it as still. Everything moves, even the things that look solid." He let the stone drop. It hit the ground softly. Animals just notice sooner. Let me tell you about intuition. People often think it's guesswork, but in farming communities, intuition is built from repetition. Thousands of small observations. The way cattle shift weight before a storm. The way birds change flight paths over certain fields. The way a tractor engine sounds 1 degree off when a bearing begins to fail. It isn't magic. It is memory trained by time. Kevin nodded slowly. For the first time, he didn't try to argue. Months passed. The south pasture remained closed. The ground stabilized. New drainage systems were installed. Geologists continued studying the underground cavity, publishing papers that referenced the Hensley site in academic journals. But life on the farm didn't stop. Walter rebuilt fences, rotated grazing areas, kept the farm running just as he always had. The machine still started on the second turn of the key, still pulled hay wagons like it was 1952, still carried the weight of decades without complaint. Kevin visited occasionally, at first for reports, later just to talk. And slowly, something unusual happened. He stopped bringing spreadsheets. He started bringing questions. One evening in late autumn, Kevin arrived as Walter was tightening a loose chain on the old hay wagon, the same wagon he had saved during the collapse. Kevin leaned against a post. "You ever think about retiring?" he asked. Walter didn't look up. "I already did once." Kevin smiled faintly. "That's not an answer." Walter tightened the last bolt, then stood. "This place doesn't need me to stop working," he said. "It needs me to notice when something stops working." Kevin nodded. That made more sense than anything he'd learned in business school. Years later, people would still visit the Hensley farm, not for tourism, for understanding, because something about that place stayed in people's minds. The idea that animals noticed danger before humans did wasn't just a story anymore. It was documented, measured, accepted, but Walter never called it anything special. To him, it was just another day on land he had learned to listen to. In the winter of 1992, Walter's health began to slow him down. Nothing dramatic, just age doing what age does. Susan took over more responsibilities. Kevin helped with financial planning. The farm still ran, but Walter began letting others drive it more often. One quiet morning in March 1993, Walter walked out to the barn alone. The air was cold. The fields were still. He stood beside the tractor for a long time. Then he placed his hand on its hood, like greeting an old friend. "Let me tell you about machines like this. They don't become important because they are fast or advanced. They become important because they are consistent. They don't change their behavior unless something forces them to. And in that way, they are honest." Walter understood that better than most people ever would. That spring, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. No emergency, no struggle, just the end of a long life, spent close to the ground he loved. At his funeral, Kevin stood near the back of the church. He didn't speak, but afterward, he returned to the farm alone. The cattle were grazing on the north pasture. The south field remained quiet. And for a moment, Kevin thought he could still see Walter standing near the fence line, watching, waiting, listening. 10 years later, the farm was still running, repainted carefully, maintained faithfully, still doing exactly what it was built to do. Kevin had become the one who made sure of that. He had left banking behind years earlier. Now he worked with rural land restoration projects across Iowa, often telling young engineers a simple truth. If the animals all agree something is wrong, you don't ignore it. You investigate faster. People used to laugh when he said it. Not anymore, because by then they had all seen what he had seen. The final philosophical truth of that farm was simple. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to listen. If you ever find yourself on land that feels too quiet, too still, too careful in ways you can't explain, pay attention. Because sometimes the first warning doesn't come from machines. It comes from life that has been there longer than you, and it never raises its voice. It doesn't have to. The land speaks first through those who live closest to it. And if you're lucky enough to hear it in time, you get to keep what others lose. Walter used to say nothing lasts forever, but some things come close. And in Jackson County, Iowa, the machines still hum on warm afternoons, the cattle still shift before the weather turns, and Kevin Mercer still walks the edge of old fields, listening, long after the warning has already passed. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to learn how to listen.